The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished stone and living crystal. Light from a dozen captured stars filtered through the dome above, casting rainbow shadows across the assembled delegates of 859 species. This was the heart of galactic civilization, the place where wars ended and alliances began, where the fate of trillions was decided with a single vote. Catherine Moore walked alone down the central pathway. Her footsteps echoed in the vast silence that always preceded a major address. She was 57 years old, silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent in service to causes greater than herself. She had been humanity's ambassador to the Council for 18 years, and in that time she had earned a reputation as someone who never gave up, never stopped talking, never stopped believing that words could change the universe. Today she carried a data chip in her hand. It was small enough to fit in her palm, but it contained evidence that could shake the foundations of galactic society. 3 years of investigation, thousands of hours of footage, genetic samples, survivor testimony, intercepted military communications. Everything pointed to one terrible truth. The Cathari Empire had been harvesting sentient beings from protected worlds. Catherine reached the speaker's platform and turned to face the assembly. She saw familiar faces among the crowd. The Morvith delegation sat in their customary place near the front, their massive bodies draped in ceremonial robes. The Pelori occupied the upper galleries, their delicate frames barely visible against the bright lights. The Vesh, the Telori, the countless others who made up this vast community of species. She had worked with all of them at one time or another. She had mediated their disputes, celebrated their victories, mourned their losses, and there directly across from her position sat the Cathari delegation. High Minister Vorath watched her with 4 cold eyes, his scaled face betraying nothing. Catherine activated her display. Images filled the air above the chamber. Children, families, entire communities vanishing in the night. Processing facilities hidden in asteroid fields. Transport ships with modified cargo holds designed to keep living beings alive just long enough to reach their destination. She spoke for 3 hours. She presented every piece of evidence with careful precision, explaining its source, its verification, its implications. She named the worlds that had been targeted. She showed the faces of survivors who had escaped to tell their stories. She played intercepted communications between Cathari military commanders, discussing quotas and harvesting schedules. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Catherine allowed herself a moment of hope. Surely they could see. Surely they understood. The evidence was overwhelming. No reasonable being could look at what she had shown them and conclude anything other than the truth. Hi, Minister Vorath rose from his seat. He was ancient by Cathari standards, his scales faded to a dull gray. But his voice still carried the weight of absolute authority. The Council thanks the human delegation for this entertaining presentation, he said. However, we must question the reliability of evidence gathered by such a young and inexperienced species. Humanity has been part of our civilization for barely a century. You have much to learn about the complexities of galactic politics. Catherine felt her heart sink. High Minister, the evidence speaks for itself. We have genetic verification, visual confirmation, testimony from hundreds of witnesses. Fabricated, Vorath said simply. Human technology is notoriously unreliable. Your species has a documented tendency toward emotional exaggeration. I suggest that what you have shown us today is nothing more than a misunderstanding, perhaps combined with deliberate manipulation by enemies of the Cathari people. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Catherine looked around desperately, seeking support. The Morvith delegate avoided her eyes. The Pelori representative studied his notes with sudden, intense interest. Even species she had helped in the past seemed unwilling to meet her gaze. I call for a vote, Vorath continued. Let the Council decide whether human accusations have any merit, or whether this is simply another example of human interference in affairs beyond their understanding. The voting began. Catherine watched the numbers climb on the central display. Against. Species after species rejected the evidence. Dismissed the testimony? Chose political convenience over justice? The Morveth voted against. The Vesh voted against. Even the Talor, whose own citizens had been among those harvested, voted against. The final count appeared in glowing symbols above the chamber. 847 against. 12 in favor. Vorath allowed himself a thin smile. It appears the council has spoken. Human accusations are hereby dismissed as baseless fabrication. Furthermore, I suggest that perhaps Earth's membership status should be reviewed. A species that makes such wild claims without proper foundation may not be ready for full participation in galactic affairs. Laughter. It started somewhere in the upper galleries and spread like a disease through the chamber. 847 species laughing at human concern for the innocent. 847 species mocking the very concept of justice. Catherine stood frozen at the podium. She had prepared for many outcomes. She had prepared for debate, for compromise, for partial measures. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared to watch the galaxy choose cruelty and call it wisdom. The laughter continued. It echoed off the crystal dome and the polished stone walls. It filled the great chamber until there was no room for anything else. Catherine gathered her materials. She did not speak. She did not argue. She did not make one final plea for reason. She simply bowed once to the empty center of the chamber, the place where justice should have stood, and turned away. She walked back down the central pathway. Behind her, silently, every human delegate rose from their seats. Every aide, every translator, every staff member, they fell into step behind their ambassador, a procession of silent figures moving through the laughing crowd. The doors of the great chamber closed behind them. The laughter faded into the distance. Catherine found her deputy, a young man named Christopher Wells, waiting in the corridor. His face was pale with shock. "Ambassador," he said. "What do we do now?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the children in those images. She thought about the survivors who had trusted her to tell their story. She thought about 112 years of humanity giving everything it had to a galaxy that saw them as nothing more than a joke. "Send the signal," she said. "All channels. All stations." Christopher stared at her. "The withdrawal protocol? Ambassador, that has never been used. The consequences would be enormous. Send it." Within 6 hours, every human embassy in council space went dark. Diplomatic staff boarded transports and jumped to hyperspace without a word of explanation. Trade stations shut down. Relief ships abandoned their routes. Research outposts transmitted final data bursts and powered down their communications arrays. The last human vessel to leave council space was Catherine's own diplomatic cruiser. As it reached the jump point, she stood at the observation window and looked back at the stars that humanity had called home for over a century. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The ship jumped, and humanity vanished from the galactic stage. Not with anger. Not with threats. Not with any of the endless words that humans were so famous for. Just silence. The galaxy noticed immediately. They noticed because humans had never stopped talking in 112 years. They had never stopped helping, never stopped mediating, never stopped being impossibly, irritatingly present in every corner of civilized space. Now, there was only absence, only quiet, only the growing realization that something fundamental had changed on Vareth Prime. The council continued its session as if nothing had happened. High Minister Vorath delivered a speech about human immaturity and the importance of maintaining proper order. The delegates applauded politely, but somewhere in the back of the chamber, Junior Peloriade looked at his communication device and frowned. A human medical ship had been scheduled to arrive at his homeworld tomorrow, carrying supplies for a hospital that served 3 million people. The ship had just sent its cancellation notice. No explanation. No apology. Just a single line of text. Services suspended indefinitely. The aide tried to send a reply to ask for clarification, to beg for reconsideration. His message bounced back immediately. Humans were no longer accepting. Communications. The silence had begun. 3 months passed and the galaxy began to understand what it had. Lost TIE Counselor Zethan, of the Morvith Collective, sat in his private office and stared at the reports covering his desk. They arrived every hour now, each one bringing worse news than the last. Trade disruptions, diplomatic failures, humanitarian crises spreading across the outer territories like fire through dry grass. He had voted against the humans. He remembered it clearly. The evidence had seemed convincing at the time, but Vorath had spoken with such certainty, and the political cost of opposing the Cathari had seemed too high. It was easier to believe that the humans were exaggerating. It was easier to laugh along with everyone else. Now no one was laughing. The first real crisis came from the Pelori system. Their atmospheric processors had been failing for decades, slowly degrading despite constant repairs. Human engineers had maintained these systems for 60 years as part of their humanitarian missions. Every 3 months, a team would arrive, replace worn components, update software, and train local technicians. It was routine. It was expected. It was something the Pelori had stopped thinking about because the humans always took care of it. The humans did not come. Pelori officials sent messages to the human technical corps. No response. They contacted human emergency services. Silence. They reached out directly to Earth through every channel they could find, begging for assistance. A single automated message came back. Humanity regrets that it cannot assist non-allied species at this time. We wish you well in your endeavors. The atmospheric processors failed completely 6 weeks later. 40 million Pelori died before emergency measures could be implemented. Entire cities suffocated as the air turned toxic. Children collapsed in schoolyards. Elderly citizens passed away in their beds. Without ever understanding what had gone wrong, Zethan attended the memorial service. He stood among the grieving families and felt the weight of his vote pressing down on his shoulders. These people had died because the council chose to mock human concerns. These children had suffocated because it was easier to laugh than to listen. The economic collapse came next. Human shipping had always formed the backbone of neutral trade routes. Their vessels were welcome everywhere because humans had no territorial ambitions. They did not conquer. They did not exploit. They simply moved goods from one place to another, taking reasonable fees and maintaining relationships with everyone. Species that had been enemies for millennia could still trade with each other through human intermediaries. Without human ships, those routes fell silent. The Merchant Guild tried to fill the gap. Other species offered their vessels as replacements, but no one trusted them the way they trusted humans. Old suspicions flared back to life. A Vesh cargo ship was denied entry to Talari space. A Morvith trading station refused to service Cathari vessels. Within months, the economy of the Outer Rim began to fragment into isolated pockets that could barely communicate with each other. Prices for basic goods increased by 300%. Luxury items became impossible to find. Medical supplies that had once flowed freely across borders now sat in warehouses, waiting for transport that never came. And then the wars began. The Vesh, Hegemony, and the Telori Republic had disputed a border region for centuries. The arguments were ancient and complicated, involving religious sites, mineral rights, and historical grievances that predated spaceflight. For the past 80 years, human mediators had kept the peace. They hosted annual negotiations. They proposed compromises. They reminded both sides that war would cost more than any territory could ever be worth. The last human mediator left Vesh space on the day of the withdrawal. She did not say goodbye. She simply boarded her ship and departed without a word. 8 months later, Vesh warships crossed the disputed border. The Talori responded with force. What should have been a minor skirmish escalated into full-scale combat within weeks. By the end of the first year of human silence, the death toll had reached 9 million. Commander Daniel Price stood on the bridge of the human defense vessel, Rizote, and watched the distant flashes of battle. His ship held position at the edge of human space, close enough to monitor the conflict, but far enough to make clear that humanity wanted no part of it. Daniel was 43 years old. He had spent 20 years in the defense fleet, most of it on patrol duties that rarely saw any excitement. Humans were not warriors by nature. They preferred to talk, to negotiate, to to find solutions that did not require violence. The defense fleet existed mainly as a deterrent, a reminder that humanity could fight if necessary, even though they almost never chose to. Now Daniel watched. Two species tear each other apart and felt nothing but cold emptiness. His communications officer, Lieutenant Maria Santos, approached with a datapad. She was young, barely 25, and the strain of recent months showed on her face. "Sir," she said quietly, "another request for humanitarian assistance. The Talori are asking for medical ships. Their civilian casualties are in the millions. Hospitals are overwhelmed. They have children dying from treatable injuries because they cannot get supplies through the blockade." Daniel took the datapad and read the message. It was desperate, pleading. The Talori government was offering anything humanity wanted in exchange for help. Trade concessions, political support, formal apologies for their vote against the human evidence. He remembered the council chamber. He had watched the recording dozens of times since the withdrawal. He had seen the Talori delegate laugh along with everyone else. He had seen them dismiss the suffering of innocents as human exaggeration. "Log it," Daniel said. "File it with the others." Maria hesitated. "Sir, there are children dying. There were children dying when we presented our evidence. Children being harvested. Children being processed." The Talori laughed. Daniel handed back the datapad. "Log the request." "That is all." Maria nodded slowly and walked away. Daniel could see the conflict in her posture, the tension between her training and her conscience. She had joined the fleet to help people. All humans join their service branches to help people. It was what they did. It was who they were or who they had been. The request file now contained over 17,000 entries. 17,000 desperate pleas from species across the galaxy, medical emergencies, natural disasters, political crises, economic collapses, all of them asking humanity to return, to help, to be the species they had always been. Humanity responded to none of them. On Earth, the unified government met in continuous session. They reviewed every request. They documented every crisis. They tracked every death that might have been prevented if the council had simply listened. Catherine Moore attended these sessions when her health allowed. The withdrawal had taken something from her. She moved more slowly now. She spoke less. The fire that had driven her diplomatic career for decades had been replaced by something quieter and harder. "We are not punishing them," she said during one particularly difficult debate. "We are showing them the truth. We are showing them what the galaxy looks like without us. They never valued what we gave because they never knew what it cost us. Now they are learning." A junior minister raised his hand. "Ambassador, how long do we maintain the silence? People are dying. Millions of people." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Millions died while we were present and begging for help." The council laughed. "They called our evidence fabrication. They suggested we were too immature to participate in galactic affairs." She looked around the chamber at the assembled leaders of humanity. "We will speak again when they are ready to listen. Not before." The silence continued. Across the galaxy, the chaos deepened. The HFY War spread to neighboring systems. Economic instability triggered political upheavals on dozens of worlds. The Cathari continued their harvesting operations. Emboldened by the Council's support and humanity's absence, and in the darkness between stars, 17,000 requests for help went unanswered. Humanity had always been the voice of conscience in a galaxy that preferred convenience. Now that voice was silent, and the galaxy was finally beginning to understand how much they had lost. The void was growing. 2 years into the silence, the Galactic Council called an emergency session. The great chamber on Verath Prime felt different now. The captured starlight still filtered through the crystal dome. The polished stone still gleamed beneath the feet of delegates from hundreds of worlds. But something essential had changed. The confidence was gone. The easy laughter had disappeared. Species that once strutted through these halls like masters of the universe now walked with hunched shoulders and worried eyes, "Hi, Minister." Voreth of the Cathari was not laughing anymore. He sat in his customary seat and watched the delegates file into the chamber. 2 years ago, he had stood at the central podium and mocked human evidence as fabrication. He had called them children playing at civilization. He had suggested their membership should be revoked. The council had applauded. They had laughed. They had voted exactly as he wanted. Now Voreth looked around the chamber and saw the cost of that vote written on every face. The Pelori delegation was half its former size. They could not afford to send more representatives after the atmospheric disaster. The Vesh and Telluri sat on opposite sides of the room, their delegates glaring at each other with undisguised hatred. 14 species were currently engaged in active conflicts that human mediators would have prevented and protected. Worlds that Voroth had fought so hard to keep under. Cathari control were now fully within his empire. The harvesting operations continued without interference. But somehow the victory felt hollow. The humans had been right about everything. The evidence was real. The atrocities were real. And now, with no human observers to document the crimes, no human courts to appeal to, no human voices to cry out for justice, the Cathari found that their actions existed in a terrible vacuum. Other species watched. They remembered how icily the Council had dismissed human concerns. They understood that their own petitions could be treated the same way. Trust was dying throughout the galaxy. Poisoned by the memory of that laughter, High Counselor Zethan rose to address the assembly. He looked older than he had 2 years ago. The weight of his vote had aged him in ways that time alone could not explain. "Fellow delegates," he began, "we face a crisis unlike any in recorded history. The human withdrawal has destabilized every aspect of galactic civilization. Our economy is fractured. Our diplomatic channels have collapsed. Wars rage across territories that knew peace for generations." He paused and looked around the chamber. "We must compel the humans to return to their proper place. Their absence threatens us all." The Morvith proposal was simple. Economic sanctions against Earth, seizure of human assets in council space, and if these measures failed, a show of military force to remind humanity that they could not simply withdraw from galactic civilization whenever they chose. The debate lasted for hours. Some delegates argued for caution. The humans had never shown aggression before, but their recent behavior was unprecedented. Perhaps a softer approach would be more effective. Perhaps diplomacy could succeed where demands might fail. Others dismissed these concerns. Humanity was one species among hundreds. Their technology was adequate but not exceptional. Their military was designed for defense, not conquest. A show of overwhelming force would remind them of their proper place in the galactic order. The vote passed with strong support. A coalition fleet of 200 vessels was assembled from 12 different species: battleships and carriers, destroyers, and support craft. It was the largest military force gathered under council authority in over a century. Admiral Disqual, the Morvith Collective, took command. He was a veteran of 3 border conflicts and countless peacekeeping operations. He had never lost a battle and did not expect to lose this one. The fleet jumped to the edge of human space on a bright morning by Earth's calendar. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. Weapons charged, shields raised, ready to deliver their ultimatum. What they found changed everything. The human defense grid had been transformed. Where once there were scattered stations and patrol ships, now there was a wall of metal and fire that stretched across every approach to human territory. Thousands of weapon platforms hung in the void. Hundreds of warships held position in layered defensive formations. Sensor networks extended for light years in every direction, tracking every vessel, every missile, every potential threat. Vethel stared at his tactical display and felt the first cold touch of doubt. "Analysis," he demanded. "How is this possible? Human industrial capacity should not support construction on this scale." His tactical officer worked frantically at her console. "Admiral, our intelligence was based on data from before the withdrawal. It appears the humans have spent the past 2 years converting their entire economy to military production. Shipyards that once built cargo vessels now produce warships. Factories that manufactured consumer goods now create weapons. Their output has increased by a factor of 12. Vettel studied the display. 12 times their previous capacity. The humans had taken 2 years of silence and used every moment to prepare for exactly this confrontation. A communication signal flashed on his console. Someone was hailing the fleet. On screen, Vettel ordered. A human face appeared. A woman in her 60s with gray hair cut short and eyes that held no warmth at all. She wore the uniform of Earth's Defense Command, and the insignia on her collar marked her as an admiral. "This is Admiral Patricia Coleman of Earth Defense Command," she said. Her voice was calm and flat. "You have entered human sovereign space. You have 30 seconds to withdraw or be destroyed. This is your only warning." Vettel almost laughed. Almost. But something in the woman's eyes stopped him. There was no fear there, no uncertainty. No hint that she was bluffing. "Admiral Coleman," he replied, "you cannot threaten the combined might of the Galactic Council. You are one species. We are hundreds. Our fleet represents the unified will of galactic civilization. Stand down and accept our terms, or face the consequences." Patricia's expression did not change. 20 seconds. "You are being unreasonable. We have come to negotiate the terms of your return to council membership. There is no need for threats. 10 seconds. Vettel felt sweat forming on his brow. This was not how humans behaved. They talked. They negotiated. They found compromises. They did not issue ultimatums and count down to violence. She would not dare attack a council fleet. The political consequences alone would be catastrophic. Think of what you are doing. 5 seconds. You are bluffing. Humans always talk. You always find another way. You would never actually fire on us. Time expired. The human defense grid opened fire. Vettel had commanded warships for 40 years. He had seen battles that lasted hours, complex engagements where tactics and strategy determined the outcome. He had never seen anything like this. The human weapons struck with precision that bordered on supernatural. Every shot found its target. Every missile evaded countermeasures. Every beam punched through shields that should have held for minutes in 14 seconds. The coalition fleet lost 67 vessels. Vessels, Paith, single quotes AAL, watched in horror. As battleships that had taken decades to build vanished in balls of superheated plasma. Carriers broke apart under concentrated fire. Destroyers simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing but expanding clouds of debris. All ships retreat. He screamed into the command channel. "Jump to hyperspace. Get us out of here." The surviving vessels scattered in every direction, fleeing without formation or coordination. Some made it to safe jump distance. Others were cut down before they could escape. The human ships did not pursue. They did not need to. The message had been delivered. Vettel's flagship limped away from the battlefield with half its systems offline and a third of its crew dead. As they prepared to jump, he took one last look at the tactical display. The human defense grid had not moved. Not a single ship had broken formation. They had destroyed a third of the coalition fleet without taking a single casualty, and through it all, not one additional word had been spoken. No demands. No negotiations. No explanations. The humans had delivered their response in the only language the council seemed to understand. Patricia Coleman watched the surviving enemy vessels flee into hyperspace. Her bridge crew sat in silence at their stations. No one cheered. No one celebrated. This was not a victory. It was a statement. "Stand down to defensive posture," she ordered quietly. "Maintain the perimeter. Log the engagement for the historical record."
Oh.
Her communications officer looked up. "Admiral, should we send a message to the council? Explain our actions." Patricia considered the question for a long moment. She thought about the laughter in that chamber 2 years ago. She thought about the millions who had died because the galaxy refused to listen. She thought about the children still being harvested on worlds that the council had abandoned to Cathari cruelty. "No," she said finally. "They heard us clearly enough." The silence continued. The battle at the border sent shockwaves through every corner of the galaxy, for the first time in living memory. A junior species had defeated a council military force. Not just defeated, humiliated. 67 warships destroyed in 14 seconds. A third of the coalition fleet, reduced to drifting wreckage without the humans losing a single vessel. The surviving commanders turned to their homeworlds with stories that spread like wildfire. They spoke of weapons that could not be dodged, shields that could not be broken, a defense grid so vast and so precise that it seemed less like technology and more like the anger of a god-made manifest. And through it all, the humans had spoken exactly 23 words. Nothing more. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. High Minister Voreth found himself standing alone. The species that had supported him, that had laughed alongside him in the council chamber, now looked at the Cathari with new eyes. They remembered that this crisis had begun with Voreth's mockery of human evidence. They remembered that the harvesting operations were real. They remembered that they had chosen to believe a lie because it was convenient. One by one, the Cathari allies began to distance themselves. Trade agreements were canceled. Diplomatic missions were recalled. Military partnerships that had lasted centuries dissolved overnight. Voreth tried to hold his coalition together. He gave speeches about human aggression. He warned of the threat posed by a species that would attack a peaceful diplomatic mission without provocation. He demanded that the council respond with overwhelming force. No one listened. The Morvith were the first to publicly break ranks. High Counselor Zethan stood before the assembly and did something unprecedented. He apologized. "We were wrong," he said. His voice carried through the great chamber, reaching every delegate, every observer, every recording device. The humans presented evidence of terrible crimes. We dismissed that evidence because it was easier than confronting the truth. We laughed at their concern for innocent lives. We mocked their dedication to justice. He paused and looked directly at the Cathari delegation. And now we know that every word they spoke was true. The investigation began 3 days later. Without Voreth's political protection, the Cathari harvesting operations were finally exposed to full scrutiny. Council investigators traveled to the protected worlds. They documented the processing facilities. They interviewed survivors. They collected evidence that made even hardened politicians physically ill. The scale was beyond anything the humans had described. Industrial operations spanning dozens of planets. Millions of victims over decades of systematic cruelty. Entire species pushed to the edge of extinction to feed Cathari biological research programs. Catherine Moore had been conservative in her estimates. The reality was far worse. The council voted unanimously to sanction the Cathari Empire. Their military was disbanded. Their leadership was arrested and tried for crimes against sentience. Voreth himself was sentenced to permanent isolation on a prison asteroid at the edge of known space. Justice, at last, was served. But humanity remained silent. Zethan understood that punishment for the Cathari was not enough. The council had failed in ways that went far beyond one vote on one day. They had created a system where cruelty could hide behind political convenience. They had built a civilization that valued stability over justice, comfort over truth. He decided to go to Earth himself. The journey took 3 weeks. Human border stations allowed his ship to pass but offered no escort and no communication. He traveled alone through human space, surrounded by the evidence of what humanity had built during their years of silence. Defense platforms by the thousand. Industrial stations producing warships at impossible rates. A civilization that had transformed itself from helpful neighbor to armored fortress. Zethan arrived at Earth and requested an audience with the human unified government. He waited in a small diplomatic facility for 3 weeks before receiving a response. When he finally entered the audience chamber, he found something unexpected. There were no politicians, no military officers, no diplomats trained in the art of negotiation. Instead, the chamber held ordinary citizens. Teachers and engineers, doctors and farmers, construction workers and artists. The people who would have helped, who had always helped, would spend a century giving everything they had to a galaxy that repaid them with contempt. A woman stepped forward to speak. Her name was Grace Collins. She was 71 years old, with white hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of physical labor. Before the withdrawal, she had been an aid worker in the Outer Territories. She had spent 40 years building hospitals and training medical staff on worlds that could never have afforded such services otherwise. "You have come to ask us to return," Grace said. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the chamber. "To resume our place in your council, your economy, your civilization. You have punished the Cathari. You have acknowledged your mistake. And now you expect us to forgive?" Zethan bowed his great head until it nearly touched the floor. "We were wrong. We were arrogant and cruel, and billions have suffered for our failure. Please, the galaxy needs you." Grace was silent for a long moment. Then she gestured with one hand, and holographic images filled the chamber. Children's faces. Thousands upon thousands of them. Species from across the galaxy, all of them young, all of them innocent, all of them lost. These were the victims of the Cathari harvesting. The ones who had been taken while the council laughed. The ones who could not be saved because 847 species chose politics over justice. "These are the ones we could not help," Grace said, "because you laughed. Because you decided that human testimony was worthless. Because you chose pride over the lives of children." The images continued to cycle through the chamber. Face after face after face. So many that they blurred together into a river of lost potential, stolen futures, broken families. "We brought you evidence," Grace continued. "We showed you footage of the facilities. We played recordings of survivors describing their experiences. We presented genetic proof that could not be fabricated. And your response was to suggest that humans were too immature for full council membership?" She let the images hang in the air for another long moment before dismissing them with a wave. "Tell us, counselor, how do we forgive that? How do we trust a galaxy that abandoned the innocent to protect the guilty? How do we return to a council that mocked our concern for the helpless and then demanded our help when the consequences of that mockery began to hurt them?" Zethan had no answer. He stood in the chamber, surrounded by the faces of ordinary humans, and felt the full weight of what the council had done. These were not diplomats trained to hide their feelings. These were people who had dedicated their lives to helping others and had been rewarded with contempt. "We will consider your request," Grace said finally. "But understand this. We will not return to what we were. We will not be the species that gives and gives while the galaxy takes and laughs. If we come back, it will be on our terms. As partners, not servants. As equals, not children to be mocked when we speak uncomfortable truths." She turned away, and the audience was over. Zethan returned to the council empty-handed. He reported what he had seen and heard. He described the faces of ordinary humans, the weight of their grief, the depth of their betrayal. "They will not forgive Isley," he told the assembly, "and I am not certain they should. We built this crisis with our arrogance. We fed it with our cruelty. Now we must live with the consequences." The chamber was silent. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, no one had anything to say. The humans had taught them the weight of silence. Now, the galaxy would have to learn how to earn their voice. Back, 5 years after the silence began, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The old Galactic Council had dissolved. Its authority had been shattered by years of crisis and conflict, by the memory of laughter that had cost billions of lives, by the shame of choosing convenience over justice. The great chamber on Veroth Prime stood empty now. Dust gathered on the polished stone floors. The captured starlight still filtered through the crystal dome. But it illuminated nothing but ghosts. In its place, something new was rising. They called it the Compact of Sentient Rights. Its founding document had been written by representatives from 300 species, who had watched the old order collapse and decided that something better must take its place. The words on those pages read remarkably like proposals that humanity had made for a century. The same proposals that had been voted down, dismissed, mocked, forgotten. The compact required that all evidence of atrocity be investigated regardless of political consequences. It established protected corridors for humanitarian aid that no government could block. It created an independent judiciary whose decisions could not be overruled by powerful species seeking to protect their allies. It enshrined the principles that humanity had championed for over 100 years. The principles that the Council had laughed at in that chamber 5 years ago, and humanity had agreed to help. They built it. The negotiations had taken 18 months. Grace Collins had led the human delegation, supported by Catherine Moore, in a team of diplomats who understood that this was humanity's chance to reshape galactic civilization. They had demanded guarantees. They had required structural changes that would prevent any future council from dismissing evidence the way the old one had. They had insisted on mechanisms that would hold the PCH as powerful accountable for their crimes against the weak. The other species had agreed to everything. They had no choice. The galaxy was falling apart without human participation, and everyone knew it. Catherine Moore stood once again on Verith Prime, not in the old council chamber, but in a new hall built specifically for the Compact of Sentient Rights. It was smaller than the Great Chamber, more intimate, designed for cooperation rather than spectacle. The lighting was warm instead of dramatic. The seating was arranged in circles rather than hierarchies. She was older now. Her hair had gone completely white, and she walked with a cane that she had not needed 5 years ago. The withdrawal had taken something from her, some essential spark that had driven her diplomatic career. But standing here today, she felt a flicker of that old fire returning. Behind her stood a delegation of 300 humans, diplomats and scientists, engineers and doctors, teachers and aid workers. The same kinds of people who had walked out of the old council in silence were now walking into the new compact with hope. The ceremony was broadcast across 1,000 worlds. Billions watched as Catherine approached the central podium. The chamber was quiet, waiting for humanity to speak. She paused and looked out at the assembled representatives. Many of them could not meet her eyes. The shame was still too fresh. The memory of their cruelty was still too vivid. They had laughed at human pain, and now they had to face the species they had wronged. Catherine let the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel it. She wanted them to understand what it meant to wait for words that might never come. Then she began to speak. "We did not withdraw to punish you," she said softly. "We withdrew because we had no other choice. You left us no voice. You took our words and made them worthless. So we stopped speaking. We stopped helping. We stopped being the species that always gave and never asked for anything in return." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who flinched away from her gaze. "And you learned. Not because we taught you, but because our absence taught you. You learned what it meant to face crisis without a hand extended in friendship. You learned what it meant to live in a galaxy without hope. You learned the weight of silence." Catherine's voice grew stronger. The old fire was burning now, fueled by memory and grief, and the faintest spark of something that might have been forgiveness. "We will help you build this compact. We will stand beside you as partners, not as servants. We will share our knowledge and our resources and our endless, stubborn belief that the universe can be better than it is." She paused and let her words settle into the silence. "But understand this. We will never again be the species that speaks while others refuse to listen. If this compact fails, if justice is once again traded for convenience, if the powerful are once again allowed to prey upon the weak while civilization looks away, humanity will not simply withdraw." The threat hung unspoken in the air. Every delegate understood. Humanity had spent 5 years building something behind their borders. They had taken the lessons of their century of service and transformed themselves into something the galaxy had never seen. A species that could help or harm with equal effectiveness. A species that had learned to speak through silence and through fire. "We choose to hope," Catherine continued. "We choose to believe that this time will be different, that this compact will hold, that the galaxy has truly learned what it means when humanity speaks through silence." She extended her hand to the compact's first president. His name was Sereth, a Pelori, who had lost 3 children in the atmospheric disaster. He had spent the years since then working to build something that would prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. His hand trembled as he reached out to take Catherine's. "Let us begin," she said. Their hands clasped, and the chamber erupted in applause. Not the mocking laughter of 5 years ago, but genuine celebration. Relief and hope, and the desperate desire to believe that the worst was finally over. Humanity had returned to the galactic stage, not as the eager helpers they had once been, but as something stronger, something tempered by betrayal and forged in silence. 50 years later, the Compact of Sentient Rights had become the most successful interstellar government in recorded history. Its courts had prosecuted 17 cases of species-level atrocity. Its humanitarian corps had responded to over 4,000 disasters. Its mediation services had prevented an estimated 200 wars. At the heart of the Compact's headquarters stood a memorial, a simple wall of dark stone stretching for nearly a kilometer, covered in names. Every victim of the Cathari harvesting, every casualty of the conflicts that followed humanity's withdrawal, every person who died because the old council chose pride over justice. Below the names was an inscription carved in every known language. They spoke. We did not listen. Never again. Human children visited the memorial on school trips. They learned about the silence, about the cost, about the weight of words unheard. They learned that their ancestors had tried to save the innocent and had been mocked for their compassion. They learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. A young man named Samuel Carter stood before the wall on a quiet afternoon. He was 24 years old, newly graduated from the Diplomatic Academy, preparing for his first assignment as a junior attached to the Compact's humanitarian division. In his pocket, he carried a small token, a fragment of the original evidence chip that Catherine Moore had presented to the old council. The one they had dismissed, the one that had changed everything. Catherine had given it to him herself. She was very old now, confined to a care facility in the city where she had been born. But her mind was still sharp, and she had recognized something in the young man who came to visit her. "You remind me of myself," she had told him. Young and idealistic and absolutely certain that words can change the universe. Samuel had asked her what advice she could offer, what wisdom she had gained from a lifetime of diplomacy, from triumph and tragedy, from silence and speech. Catherine had smiled and pressed the chip fragment into his hand. "Speak the truth," she said. "Speak it clearly and speak it often. Never let them tell you that your voice does not matter." She had paused then, and her eyes had grown distant, looking at something only she could see. "But if they refuse to listen, if they mock your compassion and dismiss your evidence and laugh at your concern for the innocent, then let the silence speak for you. Let them learn what the galaxy looks like without hope. Let them understand the weight of the void they have created." Samuel stood before the memorial wall and read the names of the dead. Thousands upon thousands of names and scripts from hundreds of worlds. Each one a life cut short. Each one a story that ended too soon. He did not know what challenges awaited him. He did not know what injustices he would face or what cruelty he would witness. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. When he spoke the truth, he would speak it clearly. And if they did not listen, he would let the silence speak for him. The lesson had been learned. The price had been paid. And humanity would make certain that the galaxy never forgot. Never again.